Yeah, we can start.
Good morning and welcome to another webinar conversation that is brought to you by the Ateneo Department of Sociology and Anthropology in partnership with the University for Peace in Costa Rica, the Nippon Foundation, and the Asian Peacebuilders Scholarship Program. Today's conversation will delve extensively into parallel developments, counter developments. The main objective of today's conversation is to recognize primarily the extent with which development has become a global undertaking, so much so that parallel development processes, practices, and projects, particularly in the Global South, have emerged. More importantly, these processes, practices, and projects have provided spaces for interrogating and challenging dominant development paradigms and practices. So we basically have two questions which we hope to address this morning. The first one is, in what ways have development processes in Asia, well, in the Philippines in this case, reproduced and reinforced prevailing and dominant conceptualizations, paradigms, and practices of development globally? To what extent have development paths been similar? And in what ways have they been distinct? The second question that we hope to shed light on and address would be, what is the nature and extent of counter developments? Which groups initiate and stand to benefit from them? Are there episodes where attempts at engendering alternative and supposedly more inclusive development practices actually exclude? We have three renowned and distinguished resource speakers for this morning, for today's webinar. We will begin with Dr. Lisa Lim. Dr. Lim is a part-time faculty at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo de Manila University. She earned her PhD and MA in sociology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She also has an MA degree in regional planning from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and is also an AB Economics graduate from the same university. She is currently the executive director of the Institute of Social Order, one of the oldest NGOs in the country. Her social involvement and research interests include community development, natural resources management, environmental sociology, and local governance. For today, she will be talking about the plight of municipal fishers and how they understand and attempt to navigate and negotiate their survival through externally imposed, induced policies, and how they come up as a response with their own approaches to alternative community development. So without further ado, we now turn you over to Dr. Liza Lim. Dr. Lim, good morning. Dr. Lim, you're on mute.
Good to be here. Thank you. I hope that I would be able to impart to you some things that would be useful for understanding the plight of our one of the most neglected and marginalized sector in the country, which are the fishers. But first, before I do that, I wanted to discuss how the development theories actually look at sectors like the fishers, which come from the rural area. So how does, for example, a production-driven theories of development look at the rural areas and the rural folks? A modernization theory, as we know, says that for a society goes through a linear process of development, starting from a more traditional state to a more modern state, wherein rural areas are conceptualized as traditional, backward, and irrational. In terms of development process, development in the rural areas must be facilitated through literacy improvement, liberal democratic values being facilitated, and more importantly, stimulation of economic growth by external institutions and factors. And one of the things that is being advanced is that there has to be improvement in technology and infrastructures focused primarily on production. So here you'll see rural areas being relegated into something that needs to be changed. Okay. In terms of another theory of production-driven development, the dependency or world systems theories, the conceptualization of rural areas is that of a periphery, which is underdeveloped or undeveloped, primarily because of colonial experience, and to be able to change uh, the the area in terms of its state, its relationship with the core needs to either be severed or, for that matter, cut off or assisted to develop capacities to be part of the global division of labor. In more modern parlance that we use now, to move up the value chain. Here, um, it's a different conceptualization altogether. One, seeing the rural areas as something that needs to be brought to modernization, whereas the other see the rural areas as something that is a product of an unequal and equal relationship with a more advanced society. But the theories, if you note, are more focused on political economy or production uh, centered. Next, please. Uh, there are other conceptualizations. The Humanist Model, on the other hand, which emerged because of the concern for people not being developed despite assistance given to them, and now focus, or for that matter, focus on harnessing people's potential. So now the focus of development is not just in the rural areas, but also in the urban areas. And the approach is more of addressing human needs, social protection, opening opportunities for development, human potentials. But it seems that even with this model, there are certain people that are left in the margins. So within the context of development theory, we came up with more sustainable development models that, of course, emphasizes the triple bottom line, the economy that also promotes social equity, and which also addresses one of the things that is the main cause of inequality, which is the resources in the environment. So I think the Philippines more or less becomes one of the more one of the forefront in terms of developing this approach to our Philippine Agenda 21, which actually put forward the sustainable integrated area development. Note that I'm trying to basically summarize the theories also. But in all of those theories, what you see is a common characterization of the rural areas and its people, primarily as a resource frontier. In other words, it's a source of raw material, basically because the raw materials produces for us food, for security purposes, for development, production, and it's also seen as a space for development of industrial and commercial establishments. It's very much the peasants themselves. Unfortunately, when we talk of rural areas, they're at least in my position, I think they're treating peasants more as a homogeneous group, which depend on natural resources for livelihood development. The result of this conceptualization actually is an extractive type of economic approach that is supported by technologies that are needed for increased production. Like, for example, highly efficient way of fishing, high, inputs to farming that would increase production, uh, without necessarily taking into consideration the possible ramifications to the environment and to the people that are working there. Infrastructure development also are more focused on facilitating ease in the trade and encourage to a certain extent the influx of migrants into the area. And what are the results of that? In many rural areas, it results to the marginalization of certain rural occupations. Fishing is one of them. One of the things that I've heard fishers talk about is that because of infrastructure development and the emphasis on economic production, they're being eased out of their coastal residences or their communities because fishing is becoming marginalized. And in where they are being converted into tourist areas, or for that matter, um, in some cases, fish landings or other commercial establishments that are geared towards meeting the needs of migrants, or for that matter, non-fishing um, people. Okay, so what happened then? Because their occupations are marginalized, many of them out-migrate in the area, and those that migrate outside the area are those which we should be attracting in the community. So there's poverty among, it facilitated poverty among the rural folks. Next, please. So I just provided that context because I wanted to also contextualize our discussion on how the fishing is and how they understand poverty and the development that's happening in their community. So they are operating within that context, or for that matter, that kind of development ideas. And let's now look at how they see it from their perspective. Next, please. So before we do that, there are some certain important considerations that needs to be made when we're discussing the fishery sector. For one, we do know that the fishery sector is a source of food security and livelihood. Fish, as we know it, is a source of protein. Worldwide, it's considered an important food source, and fishing is actually a source of income for many people. Okay, so next. In the country, for that matter, just to illustrate, I didn't put in much statistics because for time time consideration, the Philippines ranked ninth among the top producing countries in the world, which is 2% of total world production. In terms of contribution to GNP, next please. Okay, so contribution to GNP, very small if you note, around 1.3% of the 17.4 billion. And then in terms of gross value added in terms of agriculture, next please, it's a third in terms of contribution. But given that it has very small contribution to GDP, it's no wonder that in the agricultural sector alone, or for that matter, the whole economy, attention to fisheries is very small. They have this notion that the fishers, for that matter, as a group, is very small and would have less impact in terms of society. Next, please. So by sector, it's categorized into aquaculture, which is around 40%, municipal fisheries 34%, commercial fisheries 26%. In this context, you can see also the dichotomy between those that are intended for commercial or export purposes, while the municipal fisheries cater to domestic market. Next, please. In 2012, they categorized the number of fishers employed in the fishery sector is 1.6. They're categorized by the emphasis in terms of municipal fisheries, commercial, or aquaculture. But in 2018, PSA changed or BFAR changed the configuration of their they call this categorization of fishers. So now we have a different categorization. Not that much difference, 1.8 million people engaged in fisheries. These are registered fishers. We have capture fishing, which is, and then aquaculture. Fish vending, gleaning, and fish processing are related activities, but these three are actually more or less done by the women fishers in the community. Okay. Next, please. So that's how that is how the fishers more or less figure in our socioeconomic environment. But how about environmental considerations? If we note, fishing operates in coastal, mangrove, and marine environment, which are common properties, so that access to these resources are open to everyone. They can be controlled, they can be regulated, but at the same time also you cannot stop people from getting more or less from this environment. And because everybody has access to it, they're prone also to tragedy of the commons, which happens in the Philippine fishing grounds, particularly the municipal fishing grounds, which are scientists have already said that they are already considered at the verge of non-sustainability. 85% of our municipal waters are overfished. Okay, but the prevailing notion is still there. Okay, so given this context, what is the profile of our fishers? Firstly, next please, next slide. Uh, They are the second poorest in the country. Poverty incidence before in the 2015 is 26.2%. Now they are below. Now is 26.2%. In 2015 is 36.9%. So they were saying that there's improvement in terms of poverty situation. But at the same time, also while they're doing that, while they're claiming that, fishers are saying that they didn't see anything different from their way of life. Fishing is still an occupation of last recourse. They're still confronted with intense competition from illegal commercial fishers, and because of that, they have resorted to the use of destructive fishing practices. What do we mean by that? Dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing, mainly because they have to make up for the lost catch uh, that are more or less taken away by them by commercial fishers that have highly efficient gears that more or less are able to encroach in their municipal fishing grounds. Simultaneously, because municipal fishers also live on the coast, they are the ones that are first confronted with the impact of climate change and storm surge, destruction of coastal marine ecosystems, and more recently, in many of the dialogues with fisher folks, they're actually also affected by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, because of restricted mobility and isolation, which adversely affected also their ability to pursue their occupation. If you want some more details of that, I've included a link to that, but I don't think I have the time actually to discuss it. So I will leave it to you to look into it. Okay, next, please. Fishers are also considered peasants. Okay, but many of them are engaged in fishing on part-time basis, primarily to only augment their income from agriculture. Okay, so and because of that's also one of the reasons primarily, which is why to a certain extent, not that much attention has been given to them because they are lumped into the agricultural worker sector. But fishing is an occupation that is a household enterprise. We're talking of men and women and children here, wherein the uh, male members of the family, including the children, are engaged in fishing mostly at night because fish are caught mostly at night, and then the females assuming the task of selling the catch and doing domestic work, usually in the morning. So that when we're talking also of gender equality, by the way, fishing is a male-dominated occupation. When we're talking of gender equality, what they will be saying is that, but we distribute also our efforts. The men are in charge of production, but distribution are females. So in case that the men cannot go out because of climate change or certain circumstances, the females in some cases go to mangrove areas where they glean and forage for food, so that mangrove areas in the community are considered as the domain of the women. Okay. Uh, in case of organizing also, what because the men are usually out at night, they have to sleep in the morning. So in most meetings, it's the females who actually attend meetings. So they are the ones that are discussing community organizing and community development and approaches and how they're going to develop their communities. Next, please. Again, per type of fishers, if we want to categorize it, we have the municipal fishers. Basically, in terms of ownership of production, they use non-motorized boats or small boats, which can only go out near shore. And then we have the fish workers. These are the ones that are regularly employed in commercial fisheries or industries. So if we're looking at, for example, in the context of proletarianization, which we have been discussing before, I would tend to think that the proletarianization occurs more on the commercial sector and the aquaculture sector, while the municipal fishers are still left on the margins. And in most cases, they also perceive that being a fish worker is better to a certain extent, okay, because they do have regular income. Okay, but there's also stratification among them. You can categorize them as artisanal. In other words, they can own average sized boats, and they can employ others with income sharing as a distribution, as a way to distribute income. uh, and the subsistence fishers, who are the majority, by the way, they don't own any motorized boat. Their gears are inferior, and in some cases, if opportunities are available, they hire themselves to other fishers. And because of this, they are more marginalized, more prone also to destructive types of fishing methods. Pretty much because they are the ones that are affected by um, by the competition from it, because they cannot get out uh, far in the ocean. Next, please. So if we're going to look into the poverty cycle among the municipal fishers, what you see, for example, is that there's competition from commercial fishers that results of poverty and marginalization and destructive practices, inefficient fishery law enforcement, which also contributes to the depletion of their resources, and then limited access to fishery resource. These are being aggravated by typhoons and this time the restrictions of COVID, which also results to food security and settlement concerns. So maybe I'm gonna skip a little bit. So, Kaloy, can you just click and then we'll just stop. We'll just ano. So, in terms of institutional framework, next please. Municipal fishers have long been engaged in conflict with large-scale commercial fishers and traders. And for that matter, I put it on a positive note because in light of this, they are more organized and actively engaged in engaging the national government, including the legislature, for putting more legal instruments that can allow them to harness and protect their municipal fishing and coastal and marine resource bases. Next, please. Next. So these are just the legal framework. I'm not going to discuss that anymore. They are able to advance and also win this to a certain extent. Next, please. But in all of this, how do they see themselves in the development process? First off, as I mentioned earlier, they felt that their experience of poverty remained the same, but it's generally of late exacerbated by the quarantine policies, which also limited their mobility. In some cases, they were saying that although there's no legal mandate to constrain their fishing, when it's implemented by the local government, they are also constrained from fishing. So they have limited mobilization, they're isolated. And also at the same time, because they cannot get out of their community, market for their products becomes limited, resulting to reduced income and also poverty. In some cases, there were also incidents now of their houses being demolished to give way to some projects of the government and business and setting up of business and commercial enterprises, mainly because they live on the coastal areas. What in some cases, the coastal areas are identified as not necessarily suitable for residences, so they are being eased out also, and also to give way to sustainable tourism. But the call of the fishers is that but our livelihood is there. We cannot just leave our boat there. So what they're calling for is more sustainable housing facilities for them. They still face competition from large-scale fishers, especially now. Their coastal and marine resources continues to be depleted, and because of this, they feel that the legal framework, which pretty much are there to protect their resource bases health, because it allows them also to take action to address their situation. But in terms of law enforcement, they feel that government support is still lacking. Okay, next, please. So, as I said, they're organized. And if you look into the posters that they have, there's a pattern there that you can see. They're not really looking for support in terms of livelihood. What they're looking for is actually the protection of their resource bases, okay, which is the source of their occupation. I think to a certain extent, this is different from what you see in other sectors where the need really for services and the need for support is there. But in their cases, what they want is really support in terms of protecting their resource base, okay, their source of livelihood, and also a way of life for them. Next, please. So this is Panagat is one of the networks in the country that's it's an alliance of NGO, civil society, and fisher organization. But if you look into their call also, you would note that most of their calls are actually support for their livelihood, not so much in terms of subsidies or for that matter, aid or donations. Next, please. So to a certain extent, if you look at their claim, what they're claiming for is not so much of support, as I mentioned. And because it's not coming, what they see is that the initiative to protect their coastal and marine resources are on their hands, in their communities themselves. On one hand, as I mentioned earlier when we were discussing, it encouraged mobilization among the fisher folks and get them to coordinate and link with each other. But at the same time also, it they are now depending on themselves to be able to help themselves. And also, they do that through critical engagement with local institutions. So that's the next step. How does it dovetails with development process? If you note in many of their claims, what you see is that it actually dovetails with the sustainable development framework. Okay? In other words, meeting the needs of present generation without necessarily compromising the ability of the future generation to meet themselves. The triple bottom line. That's what they want. They wanted to first protect their environment because that's the source of their livelihood, but and also at the same time, very clear. The tension and conflicts very clear with large-scale commercial fishers that are encroaching in their fishing grounds, which also compel them to engage in destructive fishing practices. So that in terms of economic gains, they do not have much for themselves. So what they are also asking for is that to help them in terms of protecting their livelihood. Next, how do you do that? Next, among us, what we're discussing with the fisher is the emphasis on community-based natural resource management, whose assumptions primarily is that they operate mostly through community-based organization, but not necessarily in conflict with supportive public and private sector. They promote integration and also discourses because the emphasis is more on the protection of the environment that allows them also to ally with science-based institutions which are concerned with the protection and conservation of resources. So that in terms also of lobbying for their interests, they can actually ally with them and use evidence-based studies to back up their claim for legal and program support. Okay, next. So how do you do that? Well, one of the major assumptions of coastal resource management is that community do have the legal right and the institutions, more or less, to be rightful managers of their resource. They know what they're doing, and they don't necessarily see it to be in conflict and tension with others. They wanted to preserve first their resource bases because, according to them, if we protect our resource bases, our future would be secure. Then maybe we can actually take on other advocacies and ally with others as well. Okay. So, what are the components, therefore, of this approach? Well, first, ensuring the access and control of the community over their natural resources, the fishing grounds. How do you do that? Of course, that requires legal framework. We need to capacitate them also and build their organization so that they will be engaged in local governance. And then at the same time, also teach them environmental conservation and protection. And this one is where they interface with the science-based institutions, because we wanted to also more or less give privilege to community knowledge, and that there are certain scientific basis for that. And then, of course, we have to provide them livelihood development that more or less takes into consideration also the sustainability of their own communities. So I would have loved to give you to show you a video of that, but I will just give you the link so that you can see it, and then maybe we can just ask it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lim, for a very insightful presentation. We now proceed to our second speaker, who is no other than Dr. Mary Racelis. Dr. Racelis is professorial lecturer at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and a research scientist at the Institute of Philippine Culture. In 1979, she joined the UNICEF in New York as a global advisor, family and child welfare, women's development, and community participation. In 1983, she was appointed UNICEF Regional Director based in Nairobi, Kenya, covering 24 countries of Eastern and South Africa. In 1992, she came back to the Philippines as Country Director of the Ford Foundation, Manila. In 2000, she rejoined the IPC and the DSA. Mary works in partnership modes with NGOs, enabling them to define and pursue their own research needs and frameworks so as to articulate more effectively their rights and perspectives. She always makes sure to say with pride that she has 5 children, 13 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Today, she will be talking about unlearning development, and she draws substantial insight from organized community groups and their NGO partners in urban informal communities. She brings out the disparities between government policies that rely on economic theories developed in the industrialized West, inappropriately imposed on the many Filipinos who fall into, open quote, the informal sector, close quote. So without further ado, we now turn you over to Dr. Racelis. Good morning.
Morning, thank you, and hello to everybody who is the people who are watching this, not only our students, but other participants from whom we also learn a lot. Right, let me start by saying that kind of giving you my own experience of how you learn about development, the standard approaches, and when you come in touch with realities on the ground, how you discover you have to unlearn a lot of what you learned as, quote, the truth in the social science perspective, especially in theories. I'm really taking off from a statement made by Dr. Chester Arcilla in a webinar last week, in which he emphasized for his urban research the need for academics to unlearn privilege, unlearn academic privilege. And that's kind of one theme of this development. How do we as academic social scientists realize in ourselves that when we do research that doesn't seem to fit traditional theories about that kind of reality, that it's incumbent upon us to change that understanding. And those of us who work on the ground with ordinary groups in a really participatory way, learning from them, that's, I think, for me, where we discover the roots of social transformation. And so let me start with next slide. It starts with, you're an undergraduate. Where's the slide? Okay, you're an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate in sociology at Cornell many, many years ago, where the major discussion of society, naturally, here in the United States, was on industrial society. And maybe what was being said there made sense in the context of America and Europe. But as there I was, a freshman, fresh woman in that class, and wondering we're thinking about the Philippines, what I knew about it, and wondering to myself, does this make sense when you are talking about a country which then was still very rural, primarily rural, and going on its own trajectory? So the questioning begins to start there, which of course is what you're supposed to learn in social sciences, that you begin to question paradigms which as you discover new kinds of evidence are subject to challenge. So it begins there. Now, my immediate reaction, was to shift then into anthropology, largely because that training in New York, Cornell University, was industrial society based, and it should be on the second slide, and didn't really fit my interests. Because I intended to return to the Philippines, and I wanted frameworks that were useful for me or understandable. And that's why I shifted into anthropology, which was in the same department, because anthropology looked at cultures in all kinds of ways, which were not, at least theoretically, so biased toward industrial societies. And the value of anthropology in that context was, one, it values other cultures and societies in their own right. It's not making comparisons. That's the whole notion of cultural relativity. I don't know why, here we are. All right, cultural relativism, that you don't judge another culture in terms of your own, you just take it as is. That was the thinking at the time. Very attractive because it was not ethnocentric. It didn't assume that your own culture was the best, was correct, and that they should really, if they were more like your culture, they would be better people. Total nonsense. In anthropology, you really learn the value and respect for people's lives and cultures. So I was very happy now when, as an undergraduate, shifting into that, I could begin to grapple with what was it like in the Philippines with a huge variety there. So I returned to the Philippines, then soon after 3 babies, I think, one of whom is on the line now, I have to say, my daughter Karen. So I enrolled at the University of Philippines for graduate studies and focused very much on cultural anthropology, which was very new at the time and only had guest lecturers. But that is what brought me through Dr. Don Hart, who was a Fulbright professor at UP at the time, to do field work in Ubando, Bulacan. And that was largely a fishing, sea fishing, as well as a bangus farming, as well as somewhat agricultural and community that was connected to the city in terms of labor because it's not so far from Manila. And that's where once you're immersed in a field situation so different from what you've known, even in the Philippine context, you begin to look seriously at why is it like that? How do you make sense of it? All right, I think next slide. Where are we? All right, so I joined the IPC under Father Frank Lynch, anthropologist, and one of my first assignments was a project to do an urban study in Tondo. It was connected to the factory of Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble wanted to know what should they do in relation to the surrounding more or less urban poor, but they were not an informal settlement. It was an urban, low-income community in Tondo, many of whose residents had been there for a couple of centuries, right? Plus many migrants, of course, new migrants. And they were, corporate responsibility was coming into the picture. They wanted to know, should they play a role there? Since there were some thievery from the trucks passing through loaded with the products, shampoo, soap, and so on, was the community telling them they were not doing something right? So that's what started it. And we said, Father Lynch said, we will do that study, we'll answer your questions, but we want to do an ethnographic investigation of the community so we have some idea what is an urban community, working class group in the city today. Now that was in the, I think, late 60s or early 70s, believe it or not. So I go there to this community armed with knowledge from the Chicago school, largely in urban sociology. You learn Max Weber and Eric Simmel. The Chicago school had this notion of the ring layout, that you had the business sector in the middle, the slums were immediately adjacent because the people work in the business sector. And then but then more in the service sector, then you have the working group in that outer ring, and the final outer ring was the new suburbs, where middle-class people were leaving the city to move to the suburbs where you could have a house with a garden and so on. So that was the framework of the natural evolution of cities. Then with the theories, Max Weber, George Simmel, and many others, the idea that cities, and this is of course in industrial societies, that's where the evidence was from, are becoming impersonal. You have associational ties develop, people form clubs, associations, primary ties of family, neighborhood, community groups are leaving, are disappearing in favor of a more urban-based associational society. The trade-off is that you have more anonymity, which many see as an advantage because they don't have to worry about old ties from their earlier lives, but also the alienation that was already mentioned in our earlier discussion in this course, added to by Reisman, who wrote about the lonely crowd. You can be with many people in a city, but you can be lonely, or alienation. So that's the framework I came with. Next. And this is all social distancing and social class comes developed as a very functionalist perspective. So I arrived in Tondo, near the Procter & Gamble factory, that area, off Velasquez. We call the study off Velasquez. And what do I find? I start going, of course, my family, my husband in particular, and other friends were saying, you're going to Tondo? That's full of gangsters and drug addicts and prostitutes. It's very dangerous. Why are you going there? So mostly I didn't tell them much about what I was doing. And I went because in anthropology, you accept the situation. And of course, when I got there, I found it's an ordinary working class neighborhood. Of course, yes, there are prostitutes, there is gang warfare, but the vast majority are working people who are struggling to make a better life for themselves, for their children, and actually being part of a community, right? The primary ties were strong and certainly a family, but extended kin was important, especially if there are migrants coming in from the province to stay with their relatives in the city. The neighbors had regular get-togethers. There were many friends, there are barcadas, your capobincha is important. Certain sectors get filled with all of those from Leyte or all of those because they connect with their kin. And so I said, that doesn't fit, that doesn't fit what I learned in college. So secondary ties, of course, were present, associations, schools, but they were not easing out the primary extended ties as supposedly was happening according to then the urban literature. The sense of community was very strong and reinforced because the fiesta was a major event in which everybody got involved in some way. The youth put up build the archways, and organize the processions. The richer ones in the community have the statues for the processions, etc. Marriages are often large events in the community. You have to invite everybody, and thus everybody comes and makes lamay to condole their friends, local community. So the sense of community was very strong. Yes, there were drugs, crime, prostitution, but that you could not characterize the community by those factors. And these were clearly stereotypes about these areas, kind of sustained by middle class or the upper class people who are always afraid of any kind of disruption in their view. All right, next. All right, so then I did this like a standard, social scientist, did the study, got a lot of data and began to publish. But then some of my friends, social worker, community organizers next door in the Tondo foreshore, which was the largest informal settlement in Southeast Asia at the time, were organizing the local community, and Soto was Zone 1 Tondo organization was one of the products, and they still exist. They have evolved amazingly well. But PECO, which was an ecumenical council, which got funding for organizers from both Catholic and Protestant groups to do organizing in the context sort of under the kind of the Christian responsibility for the urban poor, that notion. So I was invited to join the board of trustees, which had been at that time were mostly pastors, Protestant pastors and Catholic priests, and they wanted to bring in more lay people who knew something about this field. And it was there, I think, that when they said, come and work with us instead of writing about them, the NGOs were saying all the time, come here, help them think through where they want to go because you're one of those social change persons, and help write up stuff and so on. And so that's what I did. To my total amazement, every time I went there, again, your notions of urban as defined by what you learned before get messed up, and it worries you because it's like there's something wrong with you but then you begin to see that that's where social change was really happening once people are organized and begin to think through their own issues and how they're going to move forward and begin to confront aspects of their own society. We always try to promote it in a non-violent way, that many things actually happen because what they're saying is, in effect, your policies don't work. When you say that what we need is housing 20 kilometers in Sapangpalay at the time, 40, 30 kilometers out of the city, doesn't make sense. We cannot survive there. That issue is still on today, and we learn by default, through making mistakes at the expense of communities because government policies have until very recently absolutely virtually forced people to move out on the middle class conception that it's housing that's the problem, houses, and that's their good. And if you have a place where they can have a small, not even a garden, but at least a settlement which is organized to have roads and so on, then things are, that's right, that's the way, that's the ideal. It's a very middle class orientation because what communities were saying is we don't want to move, even though we live in horrible circumstances in sanitation and so on. We want to stay here, just improve the situation. And that's where on-site upgrading became a reality in terms of their perspectives. And it became gradually, because these findings were occurring all over the world in informal settlements in Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia, it began to sift into the UN system, into academics very slowly. But the new orientations academically about urban interest in security, tenure security, going into the UN as a basic principle eventually, that all came out of activities on the ground worldwide, including in the Zone 1 Tondo organization, and academics like us, like Dr. Hocano, who also was involved in urban slum in Santa Ana, began to get into trying to get this into the mainstream literature of how you think about social change and social theory and so-called modernization, whatever that means. So we began, out of that experience, as a person, as an academic, I began to try to reformulate how do you capture the views of perspectives of people as the legitimate way of handling their particular situations, because what they are struggling for, as Lisa Lim just said, is security of tenure, access to resources. And resources are not only houses, certainly if they can, and they would improve their housing slowly as their income improved in their own settlements, but it's the whole community and access to the livelihood and employment, which many of them had in the area, either nearby or in the city. Hopefully one jeepney ride away only to reduce transport costs. So it was a very different perspective. And because people got organized in the Soto first, they were, over years, it took years, they were able to kind of force government to rethink its own policies. Now, this is, imagine, in martial law, this is a martial law situation. And nonetheless, because people raised these issues, in the early days, it was nonviolent. When the left groups moved in, it became more violent, and then they began to get arrested. But initially, the whole point of organizing so people can think through what are their priorities, what are their lives like, how could it improve in the context of their own resources, access to security, that they can predict what their lives will be, but getting government to pay attention and provide the kinds of support that enable them to move ahead on those terms. So, that's a learning process. What I'm saying is, for me, by being involved very frequently with urban poor communities, largely brought in by my NGO friends, but accepted by the people's organizations too, that is really a way of unlearning what you learned about development created in other circumstances than this. Let me just give you, so you get into participatory research. What are the issues that people need information on? And there was one case where it's the last slide talks about, where is that? Hold on. Yeah, skills assessment, the previous slide, go back to that. The participatory research was just as an example, right? The Soto had been struggling with the city engineer because they were doing road construction, I think not far away. Here it is, skills assessment. And the lobbying with the Department of Engineering of City of Manila, I think, was you should hire more people from our place. My goodness, the construction is just almost very close. Hire some of our people to do the construction. We're the ones who need the work. This is our area, right? And so actually, after months of that kind of back and forth negotiations, Department of the engineering office said, okay. Oh, wait, sorry. The Department of, the engineering office said, okay, give me a list of people I need for this particular construction. We're building something, sort of a settlement there. We need, 20 masons, 40 carpenters, and so on. They listed what they wanted. So it was a victory for Soto, but when they began to think, who are we going to give? What names are we going to give? They weren't sure because they didn't really know who had what skills. So they asked me, can you help us do this? So I got my students, I was teaching an undergraduate course, to go and help develop a community study of what are the skills of especially the male workers, because that's what was required. My students were terrified to go there. Tondo, are you kidding? But the community leaders assured them they would be totally safe, they would be protected, they don't have to worry. Fortunately, we didn't have all of these restrictions that universities today impose on field work of students trying to work with communities, but that's another story. And so they helped develop, these were sociology, anthropology students, they worked with the community groups, they got the younger people, many of whom had some high school education, so could grasp easily these concepts. And they did surveys of the entire area. It's a huge area by neighborhood. They clustered the returns by color, so that that was a very simple way of organizing things. So people could see this neighborhood is the green color, so you could disaggregate the data by neighborhood, and they went through that process, right? And so they found that actually, when people had written, "I'm a carpenter," when they asked, "What is your experience as a carpenter?" they had a range from everyone who had constructed an entire house in the formal sector, a proper, quote, proper house, to many who had just made a simple bangko, 3 pieces, right, where you sit and the 2 sides. And yet they put themselves down as a carpenter because they had constructed something. And that's when Soto and at that time, the NGO began to realize, hey, if we're going to supply them to be true to our, what we're forcing the city to hire our people, we have to send them qualified people. So they knew who was really qualified, that at least they were sure. But then they set up, with whatever the equivalent of TESA was at the time, a training program for those who were already in that list, but who had to improve their skills. And that was done. And as a result, over time, they began to fill in those slots. So here's an example of participatory research, which developed out of a question, a problem the community faced, where we were able to support it. Let me just add there that before my students went, I asked them to write a short 1-page statement of what they expected. And most of them were terrified. They expected, remember the Marcos period, feudalism, anti-feudalism, anti-capitalism, and so on, that they would be viewed as rich kids coming to the community, who are responsible for why the people there are poor, and they would see young men, young people glowering at them, in this social class divide. That was kind of their view. Again, a stereotype. And then I asked them to write, after that experience of being so actively involved, now what's your view of the community? Of course, it changed tremendously. And they said, they're really nice people. All these stereotypes are not true. So they learned a lot in the process. And that's very valuable, I think, for our students. Right, I think I have about maybe 7 minutes left. May I go on to the next one? There are many other examples I would love to give, but I don't have time. Just quickly, this land titling is a very good example. The government had a big program supported by Australian funds and the World Bank to systematize land titling, because we have, really incredibly difficult, complex systems, to try to simplify it. All right, so to make a long story short, they had an urban place in Quezon City to regularize titles, and they had a rural place in Leyte. They discovered, the government, and there was a local NGO organizing farmers, the local people, to this process of how you gain access to titles for the land on which you are cultivating. And I think they did reduce it from something like 130 steps before a title down to something like 25 after a while. And there was an anthropologist involved there, and I was somewhat involved there also, an Australian woman anthropologist who lived there, and then I would come in from time to time. But over time, we discovered, and the World Bank and the government in Manila complained that people were not moving. They were moving, but when you got to, I think it was step 8, there was a stop. Very few went beyond step 8. So the anthropologist and I, and me helping her, said, let's investigate. What is step 8? And so we began to talk to the farmers and say, what is step? Why do what happens at step 8? Step 8 turns out to be the time when everybody who's a stakeholder, all the landowners around that particular plot, come together, let's say at 10 in the morning. the local government is present, the national government land authority is present, and they work out the boundaries of that particular plot, right? And the mohon is then placed there. Mohon is the stone that, what is it, you know, that recognizes the boundaries. And if the adjacent landholders contest it, they argue it then and there, and they resolve it. Maybe they'll give up this if you give me the part which has that particular tree. And so they would negotiate on site. And once they agreed, there's a paper everybody signs, government signs, all the surrounding stakeholders, and the plot claimant. And that's it. So we said, so why don't you go to the next step? Because the next step is you work toward a title, because once you get the title, then you can borrow money to improve your production. That was the government World Bank view. You want to regularize land tenure security and ownership by so that you will then have a stake and be able legally to borrow significant amounts of money to improve your production. So the farmers told us, no, well, yeah, no, but that's not really our purpose. We want to be sure that this is our area now. This is our land. We can claim it. We have a piece of paper signed by everybody. But what if you, and then we asked, what if you need money for production? They said, we don't want to go to the land bank, because there, if you borrow money and you can't pay something, somebody gets sick, there's a typhoon, you lose your land. They'll take over your land, and then you're so helpless, you don't know how to work with that. With this, if we need money, we have the whole Brenda system, which is borrowing, lending, local money lenders in the community, sometimes from outside, but mainly the wealthier ones who will lend money, or your relatives, your uncle will lend you money, and the negotiation about who gets what share of the produce of the farm is negotiable. And if they're your relatives, they're not going to come down on you hard if you don't pay. Okay, so that's what we communicated to the government and the World Bank. And the World Bank then somehow in Washington, they said, oh, this project is a big failure because they didn't go to the last step, which is to get a land title so they can produce. For the farmers, it was a big success that they got to step 8 because now they had land clarity and they could operate according to the systems that they know that are much more secure for them to plan for their own future. And that's just one example of different perspectives. One says it's a failure. The farmers saw that actually this government project was a success for them up to the point of their definition of success. All right, next, I think we don't have much time. Let me just reach conclusions here. All right, so what does it mean to unlearn? It's a personal transformation in the end. It means spending time with those others, the people whom you're working with on their turf as much as possible, where they're comfortable, where their framework is what is driving their minds. You have to get out of your comfort zone and walk the talk. It means listening to, reflecting on your own and with them, trying to understand their realities as they see them. Now, you don't always have to say, that's right. You have to be very careful, not romanticizing. Anything they do is right. Only they have the right to assert it, and then you can discuss with them if you want to show them other options, if you think those are useful. But they also learn, and they like to learn when they see that there's a benefit. So you have to be committed to the changes that people are striving to achieve. Basically, that you're really in a conflict vis-a-vis other policies that don't fit. You're on their side and you're helping them make the other side, the government or whoever, business people, see the illogic of that and find some way of a compromise that works for people, right? So you reinforce their agency. That's what they have going for them. That is their resource. You build trust through frequent interaction, which enables you to tell their stories. But you basically respect them. I think we're on to all right, what does it mean? We have this, the last slide, come on. That you become a knowledge worker in what we call insurgent anthropology or sociology, a knowledge worker who resists and constantly rethinks life-denying exclusions, you're embedded within transformative modes of being and social engagement, and you're committed to encouraging and supporting critical, compassionate scholarship in the service of a just peace and self-conscious people-responsive participatory practices. That's how a group of anthropologists here develop our concepts with this worldwide group, Insurgent Scholarships for Humanity. And finally, and that's the last, what are we contributing when we are, as academics who are connected with communities and their intermediary civil society groups? You're helping with knowledge generation, that's co-production with communities, co-ownership, where they benefit in a collaborative way, and you're both co-creating their capacities as well as your own, because you unlearn in order to learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Racelis. As we continue to unlearn and as we continue to walk the talk, we now proceed to our third and final speaker for today. She is Dr. Ana Marie Karaos. Dr. Karaos is the Associate Director of the John J. Carroll Institute on Church and Social Issues, where she heads the Urban Poverty and Governance Program. Her work in advocacy-oriented research has focused on developing policy alternatives together with civil society organizations and communities on issues related to urban growth, informal settlements, housing, involuntary resettlement, community-led development, and resilience building. She is also a part-time faculty member of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the Ateneo de Manila University. For today, her presentation will revolve around the emergent concept of the right to the city, and she presents this as a counter-narrative to the prevailing neoliberal vision of the competitive global city. We turn you over now to Dr. Karaos. Good morning, Dr. Karaos.
Good morning. I'm trying to share my PowerPoint, but I don't know if you're able to see it.
I am able to see it, Dr. Karaos.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to the first slide, but I can't. Yeah, wait.
Perhaps we can ask help from our tech-savvy colleagues.
It shows on screen now, Ma'am Jing.
Yeah, but this is not the first slide.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, because my laptop is kind of slow.
Would you want me to take over?
Yeah. Wait. What is the screen that you're seeing?
It's black screen.
It's currently a blank screen.
It's a blank screen. Sige, Melis, maybe you can share the file that you have.
You can exit.
Stop share.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't even press the stop share. Now it's happening.
while we are currently encountering technical difficulties and while we're sorting it out, again, we would like to thank our online learning communities for their unwavering support and for always joining us in these webinars. Just to reemphasize, these series of webinars is brought to you by the Ateneo Department of Sociology and Anthropology in partnership with the Nippon Foundation, the University for Peace in Costa Rica, and the Asian Peacebuilders Scholarship Program. Okay. We will try to get back to Dr. Karaos and see if we can already proceed. Alternatively, Dr. Karaos, an alternative approach probably is to actually go over the presentation without the slides. Would that be fine with you? Okay, I think our speaker has been temporarily disconnected. Okay, so in that light, so far, just to do a quick recap of what we have talked about today, we started our conversation on parallel developments and counter developments with a presentation by Dr. Lim on the plight of urban fishers and how, through their experiences, how they define, how they conceptualize development, and essentially how they contribute to alternative discourses of development, which as they draw insight from their everyday experiences, transactions, and dealings with institutions of authority, or with fellow fishers, fellow urban fishers themselves. This talk was complemented nicely by the presentation of Dr. Racelis, who focused aptly on the concept of unlearning development. By that, she means that we live in a society where dominant paradigms and practices of development remain entrenched. And therefore, we are in that situation where there are opportunities to revisit, to rethink, and to actually question or even interrogate these prevailing paradigms or these current understandings of development. And based on her own robust experience and advocacy, she was able to navigate the complexity of meanings that is inherent as far as the development discourse is concerned. And she actually proposes that we continue to ask difficult questions and to continue to revisit our practices as well, which actually reminds us that radical humility is important in this regard, because it is admittedly difficult to abandon tried and tested shall we say, practices, and to actually look for more nuanced and apt development solutions and approaches, especially in globalizing and continually modernizing contexts such as ours. Okay, on that note, perhaps we can check if our third speaker is ready. Okay. We can probably, while we're waiting for Dr. Karaos to join us in this conversation, we can probably start entertaining some of the questions that were sent to us via Facebook. We are, by the way, streaming this conversation live via Facebook as well as the Zoom platform. So our spectators and the students of SOCDV 203.4 as well are free to actually send their questions, and several of them have already done so. And there is a particular question, and perhaps Dr. Racelis, may we invite Dr. Racelis to the room once more, can address this. Maybe invite her to unmute and to actually activate her camera. Hi, Dr. Racelis. There is actually a question that has something to do with the emerging features of local planning and development literature and policy. No, and I will read the question to you. One of the emerging features in the local planning and development literature and policy is this concept of climate and disaster risk management, where climate models and scenarios are used by planners to understand how, over time, land use may be negatively affected by future climate impacts. One immediate impact of this is that in risk assessment, the need to move urban poor communities away from hazard-prone areas. My question is on how policymakers and planners reconcile this, given your insights on how urban poor communities are often not given due importance in the decision-making process. In terms of theory, do you think there is space for meaningful participatory research in climate risk governance? Your thoughts, Dr. Racelis.
Yeah, so that's a very complex question, but let me try to answer some parts of it. Climate risk is kind of a new area, right? And I know from the NGOs that I work with, they are also trying to communicate to urban communities or ask urban communities, what does climate change mean to you? Which means that urban poor communities have to begin to assess, what does that mean, you know? And what we're finding is, you know, every, let's say, informal settlement has a different set of circumstances. So I think the first lesson you learn is anytime you do planning for climate risk, you have to locate it in the context of the realities of communities, that they're very heterogeneous. There's a tremendous mix, and one has to understand that would be one. So you first have to talk to the different groups who are affected, because they're affected in different ways, although there are certain commonalities. So that's one of the first things I think we have to learn. The second thing is when people see it as a genuine threat, they will begin to rethink and how they can address it. But then they have to assess it in terms of what is the reality of their lives and what options are available. Let me give you a specific example. The Baseco, for example, I know that community pretty well. And for years, they've been told they have to relocate, but they organize and they insist on staying on site. They're developing their own mangrove areas to control a bit the water coming in from the sea. And the evidence is now very clear from previous huge relocation to large areas outside that it doesn't work because the resources people had were locally, right? So government has now more or less begun to accept that in-city relocation, or if they have to move from the edges, nearby relocation where they still have access to their livelihoods is really crucial. Of course, it's hard because you have to change the whole land system of cities and that. But I think the third is whose perceptions of danger. What we have learned is there are communities that say, you know, we have been flooded. Many of them live along esteros, right? We have been subjected to flooding for the last 100 years. We know we have ways of dealing with it. You know, we move the children and the elderly, first, and we have indicators that show us when it's time to move to the school, et cetera. The men stay behind and whatever for security. But of course, when it's a large-scale typhoon, like could happen in Tacloban, then they begin to change their perspectives and recognize, all right, we have to reorganize how we do this. And there's some wonderful examples to show the kinds of developments that organized groups have made. So the mantra of many of those who were relocated from informal settlements to distant locations were, you moved us from a danger area. You said we live in a danger area to a death zone, from a danger zone to a death zone, right? Because, oh yes, it's danger, but we have ways of dealing with it. And you never ask us, how we've handled it, because often they can handle a large proportion of it through long experience. But you then decide that this danger will be resolved by moving us outside when in reality, it's a death zone for us because we can't afford to live there. And we come back to the communities anyway. So, I mean, those are the three things, right? That you have to see, what are people's perspectives on this? What have they already learned? What indigenous knowledge do they have about stress, dealing with those types of circumstances? And three, what is their situation in which this new idea of climate risk can connect? And you have to find that out. It can differ greatly from one community to another, even though there are kind of generalizations also you can make. So that's what I would say there.
Thank you, Dr. Racelis. And we just got word, and we now see her on screen. Welcome back, Dr. Karaos. We can now proceed to her presentation before we continue our conversation with our audience.
Okay. I'm really very sorry about that. I had to change my device. Okay. So please go to the title slide. I am the first slide. Yes. I titled my presentation "The City and the Citizens." It's like I hope that by the end of this presentation you would have a clear idea on why I titled it. So one of the urban sociologists who wrote about urban politics is Manuel Castells, and he has a book he wrote in 1983, "The City and the Grassroots." So it's like adopting the title a little bit, but instead of the grassroots, the citizens. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide is a quote from a UN policy brief that was shared by Professor Mary on COVID-19 in an urban world. And it says that 90% of all reported COVID-19 cases are in urban areas. So urban centers have become an epicenter of the pandemic, of a major global health crisis, even though we know that urban centers are really centers of economic activity and economic development. But maybe by virtue of that being the centers of economic activity, they have become as well centers of illnesses and other forms of violence because of the inequalities that are found in cities. Next slide. Okay, this is a quote from the same UN policy brief that released recently, and it's like an indictment, really, of the state of our cities. We have a global urban housing which forces 1 billion or 1/4 of all those living in cities in the world. They live in slums and informal settlements. The urban population in the world is about 56%. 56% live in cities that's about 4 billion people, and a fourth of them live in slums. So this inequality has forced people to be vulnerable to evictions. They live in overcrowded, low quality housing, and the pandemic has also put women at risk, no, and actually as victims of violence and abuse. So we see that the dysfunctionalities of our cities have really caused many people to suffer in cities because of these inequalities. Next slide. This is a scene which is very familiar to us. Many Asian cities have this. So this shows at the background a very modern or very prosperous sector of the city, characterized by tall buildings where financial activities take place, commercial activities, and in the foreground would be the shanties, where the workers live. Initially, they're temporary shelters, for the workers who work in the ports. So that's a middle part. There are just, well, those are sites from the port. The workers work there, and eventually their families join them, and they become informal settlements. So this contrast, between the foreground informal settlements and the more prosperous or wealthier part of the city, in which the workers also work. They're also working there as delivery persons, security guards, transport workers. But this contrasts shows us that there are really two paradigms here at work, two different development paradigms of the city. And that is what I would like to speak on the remainder of my presentation. Next slide, please. So I'm basically contrasting two paradigms, two ways of looking at the city, and two contrasting narratives. One is that of the competitive global city, which is very familiar to us, and the other, which is an emergent concept, an emergent paradigm. Well, emergent, even though the basic idea is already about 50 years old, and this is what I would like to talk to you more about. Now, so the comparison will be in terms of three things. The first is the vision of the city. How do these different paradigms look at the city? The second is the view on informality. And the third would be on how the urban poor are seen in terms of their identity. They have dual identities, or more identities, actually multiple identities. One of them is that of the informal sector, and the other is that of the worker. But in the dominant paradigm, these two identities become disconnected. Whereas in the right to the city paradigm, these identities are very much integrated, and that was what the urban poor are trying to assert, that they have these identities, and as such, they are really active citizens of the city. So I will be discussing more these statements in the future slides. Next, please. Because the right to the city concept is less familiar to us, I'd like to spend some time giving an introduction to its origin and the principles behind it. So it was first written about by Henri Lefebvre in 1967. He basically had this vision of the city as a space of encounter, generating possibilities and opportunities for collective action and requiring collective participation. And yet in today's cities, we find so much exclusion. In fact, exclusion is what defines the cities as far as the people are concerned. Many people are being excluded from the mainstream of economic life and from enjoying the benefits of living in cities. And because of this exclusion, the optimal outcomes for society and the environment and its environs cannot be achieved, according to him. So the exclusion is the reason why the cities are becoming dysfunctional. The concept of the right of the city has been formalized, sort of, and articulated in a world charter, I think in 2005, the objective of which is to rethink cities and rethink our urban models, rethink our urbanization processes, so that we can make the development more inclusive. So the objective is really to make cities inclusive, and therefore recognizing that all the people who live in cities and who contribute to the city have a right to the city. So it's about how we use urban spaces, how we decide to use urban spaces. But the principle is that the right to the city concept stands opposed to property rights over urban space. In other words, the use of urban space should not be dependent on property rights. It shouldn't be dependent on the capacity to pay. For example, our urban poor do not have the capacity to pay for land in the city because it's expensive, but that doesn't deprive them of the right to live in the city. So that is an assertion that this vision and this alternative paradigm is trying to put forward. Next slide, please. The majority of the urban population, because of certain of their characteristics, have been excluded in cities. So that is a fact that we now recognize, even though the competitive global city concept would like to hide that fact or not emphasize it. It's a reality that many of the people living in cities actually experience. And public policies, because public policies ignore the contributions of the people's processes, the struggles of the people, the actions of the people themselves in the construction of the city. Because of that non-recognition of the contributions of people's processes, our cities have become dysfunctional. So that is the main thesis of this World Charter. And so we have cities that have brought about massive evictions, segregation, and deterioration of social existence. In the Philippines, and I guess in many other cities, we have these gated communities trying to exclude the rich parts of the neighborhoods from the poorer parts. No, they feel unsafe, no, because of this coexistence, when in fact cities were made so that people can coexist together and live together and all be included as equal citizens. Next slide, please. So urban organizations and movements came together. Well, this began the First World Social Urban Forum to try to build a new model, a sustainable model of society and urban life, which is based on the following principles: solidarity, freedom, equity, dignity, social justice, and founded in respect for different urban cultures. And this is important, the balance between urban and the rural. Our vision of urban society must take into account the rural environs. The development of the urban or the city centers and the cities should not be at the expense of the rural areas. Whereas today's modern cities really emphasize so much the development of urban areas as the engines of growth without recognizing the contributions of the rural sector. So as Dr. Lisa Lim pointed out, even though the rural sectors like the fishing sector contributes only 1.7% of GDP, whereas cities, Metro Manila alone, Metro Manila alone contributes like 37% of GDP of the country. Given that disparity, there has to be greater balance in development. Next slide, please. Okay, the right to the city broadens the traditional focus on improving only neighborhoods. Okay, so many popular groups in the Philippines before used to be focused so much on improving only their particular communities. The right to the city concept actually encompasses influencing the quality of life at the scale of the city. This is an important concept which I will show examples about. And its rural surroundings. In other words, it's not just about my community. It's really looking at the city as a whole and its relationship with its surroundings. And only in that way can we make our city sustainable. So that is the assertion of this right to the city. We cannot develop our cities in isolation of the rural environment and losing sight of that and losing sight of the actions so that people really try to connect, between the urban and the rural. Losing sight of that will make our cities forever dysfunctional, experiencing all of these inequalities and inefficiencies that we are all experiencing. So for the origin and social meaning of the right to the city, this World Charter has become an instrument towards strengthening urban processes, vindications, and struggles. Okay, I will explain that more. Okay, so let's continue with the comparison. So after I've explained the right to the city, let's start with the comparison in terms of the view of the city as a system versus the view of the system as mainly constructed by agency. So the global competitive global city paradigm would have us believe, okay, and really operate from a framework that cities form a global system and network of hubs Primarily for what purpose? For the purpose of capital accumulation and for financial flows. So cities are there simply as part of a system, not to regulate and to traffic capital flows, but the very purpose of their existence is really this accumulation of capital and the flow of capital amongst cities. So cities are seen as engines of growth for national economy. So their contribution is very much recognized. As I mentioned earlier, 37% of the GDP, that's just Metro Manila. Add to it other cities, then that would be, maybe 68, 70% of GDP. So national wealth and resources are always invested in cities. That is why in the Philippines, Manila is called Imperial Manila, because the countryside, they all believe that their resources are in fact, being utilized mainly for the benefit of those living in the big cities. As a consequence, cities compete to attract capital and investments because they function as capital hubs. No? So they compete in order that investments will go to them, and so that economic growth would go faster. Consequently, states invest heavily in infrastructure in cities. Much of the spending, government budgets go into infrastructure, and they are mainly located in cities. They also try to minimize regulation so that there will be so-called ease of doing businesses. And one of the things that attracts them is this that it will be easy for businesses to get started. There are minimum regulations. In other words, competitiveness, that's the principle. Competitiveness as the goal and condition of sustainable growth. On the other hand, the right to the city paradigm, or this orientation, emphasizes that cities are primarily spaces for economic and social mobility. They are spaces for human interaction and democratic participation, and therefore cities must work for people. So people build cities. It's the actions of cities that create. It's the actions of people that create cities, and so the cities must exist for that interaction to happen and for that interaction to produce benefits for everyone. So the concept of inclusivity. Cities are constructed by human action. It harnesses the agency of citizens through social processes, mobilizations, and struggles. And therefore, solidarities are more important than competition. So notice the contrast here. Competition on the one side, where the system really dominates the agents, but on this side, it's solidarities dominated by agents. And I would like to show that through some examples, concrete examples of how mainly those marginalized from our cities, who are the urban poor, have engaged in these processes, so-called people's processes, mobilizations and struggles, which are creating new forms, built forms in our urban landscape, slowly, little by little, and influencing the way governance is happening in cities. Next slide. Okay, so this is a slide that shows the image of the globally competitive city. Building globally competitive cities is the key to Latin American growth. So it's not in 2011. So cities are always touted to be the main actors. They are the key to growth. In other words, their purpose is also to contribute to the economic growth of countries. But in fact, they're even growing faster than the national economies. Urban economies growing faster than national economies. Next slide, please. Okay, so for example, and there's always a race, there's always a contest to be among the most competitive cities in the world. Okay, so it says here, for example, nearly 72% of cities outperform their national economies. They even grow, as I said, grow faster than national economies. And cities compete with one another. In the United States, you have a city like San Jose, which is said to be more productive as compared to Buffalo, New York. And in China, there are little-known cities like Tangshan and Dongguan, that are 7 times more productive than their entire nation. So you get a sense that cities are really racing. They are in competition with one another to be among the most competitive, most productive in terms of delivering economic growth to themselves and to the national economy. But who is actually benefiting from this economic growth? Okay, that is the big question. Next slide, please. So let's look at social processes and mobilizations. In these social processes, it's also noteworthy that women play a very prominent role. They are largely unacknowledged, but they have been exercising community and public leadership and bringing to the discourse now new perspectives on gender equality. and balanced urban and rural development. So it's the championing now the role of women and greater equality and inclusivity. In the Philippines, there's a rich tradition of social movements that has supported this global call for the right to the city. And this has mainly taken the form of struggles for secure shelter that have been described by Professor Mary earlier, access to livelihood and basic services, and the recognition to be legal inhabitants. Next slide. Okay, this is an example. I will just be showing pictures, and I hope the pictures are able to depict to you this agency, okay? This sense of agency, this sense of movement, this sense of dynamism, and people really struggling to make life better for themselves while asserting their right to be in the city. So this is familiar to our students because they've seen this in a presentation by Ms. Ana Oliveros about the risk assessment, participatory risk assessment in one community in Gulod, Quezon City. And this community was successful in being able to put up together with a national agency, a government financing agency, housing for their community members in the city, in the city, in the city, changing in a way the urban form. So we have now this multi-story housing, which have been the product of people's planning. You see in this picture now, people from the community being helped by NGO workers, being helped by technical persons. And at the background, you have the person standing there is Ms. Ana Oliveira. She used to be president of Social Housing Finance Corporation. So you have a representative of government agency, and Father George Ansorena, who is a Jesuit priest who has been active in the international social housing movement. And all of them working with these communities. And communities are very busy, consulting, going on the field, also interacting with government agencies, representatives of government agencies, local governments, people very active in the building of their own housing, because they plan for it. This is people's housing. This is going too fast. Okay, so consultations happening all the time. Look, it's really mostly women. It has to be a process of constant getting the people to participate in the planning and in the construction of their own housing, as opposed to the government-produced resettlement housing, which is off city. Okay, next slide. They also connect with utility companies. This is for the electrification of the community. So they do it themselves. Now you can feel the energy and the struggles that people have to go through. So middle class people or wealthy people, as long as they have the money, they can just have the housing built for them easily, with no struggle at all. But people, the urban poor have to do many things by themselves, but they like doing that because they can plan their housing in the way they want it to serve their purposes instead of government just doing it for them. Next slide, please. This is another example, the Mangahan Floodway project, another community that's really in the so-called danger zone, in the Mangahan Floodway, and the government would not allow them to live in the banks of the Mangahan Floodway, so they had to also be involved in a people's planning process. And this is the product. Look how beautiful the community is, and this is a product of people's planning in collaboration with government agencies. They have, little by little, with opportunity being given by public programs and public policies, state policies. They have really so much. They can change so much the urban landscape and be able to provide adequate, safe, and secure housing for themselves and many others in the city. So this is another example of a product of people's planning. Next slide. And the processes that they have to go through. So step by step, they have to explain this to the community. The community have to be involved in planning the design of the housing. They have to study what are their options, what are the pros and cons. Will it be 1 story, 2 story, 3 stories? What would be the implications, the cost implications? How can they make the cost lower? They have to negotiate with the planners, with the builders, with the architects. they have to do all of those processes. But the most important is the people have to be on board all the time. They have to know all of this information because they have to be the ones making the decisions. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this is the same idea. So they also discuss livelihood. It's not just housing. They discuss about livelihood. They even discuss about pets, how to manage, because they have to talk about estate management. They are now living in a common building. It's a different form. It's a different residential form as the one that they've been used to, and so they have to learn to create policies, no, for regulating, you know, movements, no, within the buildings and taking care of common areas. So they discuss all of these things. So how to manage pets and how are they going to sustain the housing? What livelihood activities they can engage to augment their livelihood. Next slide. Okay, so these processes happen all the time in the community because they have so many things to discuss. So practically all of their time is devoted to meetings. So you have to meet very often, or several times during the week, and see women have to be there, the children have to be there also because you know, they're part of the process of planning the housing. Next slide. Community assemblies are, of course, a natural activity all the time. Again, you see mostly women. Women are the ones really constructing this new urban form in our cities through these people's planning process. So they are the ones very much interested in the details, you know, about the housing, because they are the ones who will be taking care of these houses and be living them and looking after these houses. So very important is community decision making. And before communities can decide, they have to get the information. Technical people are there to provide that information too. Next slide. Yeah, so this is another, just another example. So how many, you know, meetings that they have to go to before they could produce that new settlement, okay, that new community that you saw earlier. Next slide. The one speaking is a community organizer. This is another process that people have to engage with. They have to engage with government in a major way. This is an example. This is a meeting with the committee, with the head, the chair of the Congressional Committee on Housing. He's an ally, a very good ally of the urban poor, who has helped them in bringing to the government processes, mainstream government processes, the experience of the poor, you know, living in the resettlement sites, you know, which they did not like. You know, so they had to air the many problems that they were experiencing in the resettlement sites, the problems of the children, the problems with water, the problems with electricity, the problems of the substandard building materials that were used. So the urban poor have been creating these spaces. So what Henry Lafave was mentioning, that the city is constantly remaking itself. Why? Because the poor are trying to make space there. If the space is not there, they're trying to create a space by which they can negotiate and they can bring their own ideas and their experiences to those who hold power, so that new policies, hopefully can result, you know, from these exchanges. So the poor are very much engaged, you know, in creating these spaces for dialogue. Next slide, please. Another approach is citywide. So those are two examples. The Mangahan and the Gulod examples are about community development, developing particular communities. Now, the citywide development approach, as we're saying, the right to the city is more than just community. It's really the entire city that people are concerned about. So even the urban poor are concerned about the entire city. Next slide. This approach is being embarked upon by community associations with the help of NGOs, and also, well, initially it was the World Bank that tried to mainstream this approach. Look at the entire city and involve the people, you know, in knowing their city. And so we have here examples of enumeration, census taking, profiling, no, the residents, informal settler residents. So this is an example in Barangay 177 in Caloocan City, where a community association did a barangay-wide enumeration of informal settler families. Next slide. Okay, so this is still in Barangay 177 of Caloocan. In our webinar, one of our group webinars presented the case of the resettlement of of informal settlers in Intramuros, and they encountered there the example of the Homeless People's Federation that did a similar activity in the Intramuros area. So, but this is similar, so because the Homeless People's Federation is one of the federations that are also practicing this citywide development approach, and in fact, they did this citywide in Muntinlupa. They mapped the informal settlement settler families and enumerated, did this household survey of informal settler families in all of the barangays of Muntinlupa city. The objective being that they want a mapping of the entire city. The informal settler communities, they're not just after helping their own communities, but they also want to help other communities. They want this to be a city effort, that will impact on the lives of all informal settlers in the entire city. Next slide, please. So they're doing this enumeration in a participatory way. The people are doing it. This is the product. They will see now the profile of the informal settlements citywide. Okay, so the people have contributed to the making the information available through the enumeration that they did. So the entire city now, so they will have a view of the entire city. Next slide, please. And they will be discussing this with people in the local government. Look at the women, our women, also being very involved, identifying where the communities are, where the risk areas are, where the landmarks are, validating the maps that have been produced with the help of technical experts, validating. And they're all very interested because they want to see where their own neighborhoods are. And what's beautiful about this process is they're also being made aware of what are the conditions in other informal settler communities. And they might, for example, believe that that the situation in their community is very bad. But if they see the situation in other communities, they will see that other communities need help even more. In other words, they're able to see a broader perspective. And this process then allows next slide, allows them to participate in a process of prioritizing who in the city, which informal settlements in the city would then be prioritized by the local government to receive assistance. So this is an example. So risk maps. Now you have seen this in the example of Bulod, but this is another example. You will see on the right the legend. What are the risks that different communities are facing? Fire, flooding, narrow pathways, absence of sanitation, toilet facilities, flooding, and so on. So these risks are mapped. And what's very good is that the communities themselves get to see this and get to participate, get to validate the information, and they will see their community in relation to other communities. And this becomes a very good process of a process not only of empowerment, but also of building solidarity, so that communities don't only see their communities in isolation, they're able to see that there are similar communities in other areas, probably that need help more. Okay, so ideally, the idea here is that local governments can then prioritize which communities need more help through a process of participatory mapping, which the people themselves undertook. Next slide. A third example would be of people's mobilizations would be struggles. Okay? The two first examples are more or less representative of collaborative modes of engagement between people's organizations and other institutions and government. Now, we also see that among these social processes that we can talk about are also struggles that are more conflictual. They might seem conflictual, but they are also constructive because they are for the purpose of constructing a better city. Next slide. This would be an example of an occupation, by a planned occupation by an urban poor group, the Kadamay, which has been mentioned by Dr. Arcilia in his webinar. But this is a different area. So the Kadamay example that he talked about in his webinar is in Quezon City, but this is in Bulacan, in a resettlement site, in an off-city resettlement site. So government produced all this housing which have not been used. They are, I think, for some government employees and for police and military personnel, but they have not been occupied for whatever reason we do not know. But the Kadamay group thought that since these have been built already by government, why not allow the poor people who have no housing, no secure housing, to occupy them? So they staged this planned mobilization, this planned occupation. Next slide. Asserting, that since they are also in need of housing, why don't they be allowed to live in this housing that have already been built and are not being used? Next slide. So they're asking the president. These are tiwangwang na pabahay, so an idle housing, vacant housing, patirhan sa Maralita. Allow the poor to live in them. So these are also struggles. So this is a rally in front of the National Housing Authority. So the people are trying to convince the government, the National Housing Authority, which produced those housing, to allow them to live in these social housing projects in the resettlement sites. Next slide. All right, so I hope that gives you a feel, a sense of the activity, the agency that the poor people are really exercising to create spaces, for them to assert their right to the city that is not market-based. It is not based on their capacity to pay, but simply because they are workers in the city and they are also contributing to the building of their communities. The second aspect is the view of these two paradigms on informality. For the competitive global city paradigm, informality is a problem. Why? Because the poor cannot afford decent housing, and so they have to resort to informal housing, which is substandard, which is unsafe, which is not compliant with the building code. So that's a problem. So for the city authorities, they see informality as a problem that has to be eradicated. So what does the government do? It provides market-based solution. Those examples of housing built in the resettlement sites which have been vacant, which the people did not want to, some people did not want to live in. So market-based solutions, of course, they're compliant with the building codes, but they are far from the city. So the state relocates the poor to off-city resettlement sites because land there is cheap. And this is not free housing. The people have to pay for it. So the principle of cost recovery, even though it is partly subsidized, the people still have to pay for them. They still have to pay for the housing. So this is how the competitive global city solves the problem, so to speak, of informal housing, because they see housing as a problem. So the solution is to relocate the poor to off-city sites. But the right to the city paradigm has a different way of viewing informality. It sees informality, in fact, as a solution. It is a solution to the failure of the system, the global competitive cities system, to provide affordable and decent and secure housing for its workers. So that failure, the people, to address that failure, the people themselves found a solution, and informal housing is a solution. So even if it's non-compliant with building codes, the informal housing is in fact better. It works for them. It works for the poor. It works for them because the off-city code compliant housing, which is the alternative in the resettlement sites, deprives them of livelihood. It doesn't work for them. And that's so even if the housing looks better in terms of compliance with the building code, it doesn't work for the people because their jobs are in the city. So the informal housing ensures access to jobs and livelihood. So informality is a solution. It is not a problem. Finally, next slide. Next slide, please. I will be contrasting the two paradigms in terms of how the urban poor identity is recognized. So in the competitive global city, the urban poor are visible mainly as informal settlers, and they are invisible as workers. So the middle class and the well-to-do see them as slum dwellers, forgetting that they are also the same workers that they encounter in the workplace. Workers, transport workers, in the hotels, or security guards, especially, or construction workers, the very people who construct these very nice buildings in the cities. These are people who live in informal settlements. But the competitive global city defines the identity of the urban poor mainly in terms of housing, which is an object of consumption. And as Manuel Castells would analyze in the city and the grassroots, as cities develop, as countries develop, urban struggles are increasingly going to be waged over issues of consumption, not over issues of production anymore, like the classic trade union issues of the workers versus the capitalists. But as countries develop, the struggles will be over issues of consumption. Why? Because most of the goods of consumption will be inaccessible, even to those who have work, even to the middle class, and even to the poor, like housing. So housing has become even inaccessible also even to the middle class. So the issues of consumption will be of importance, of significance as countries develop, because the state will have an increasing role now in the provision of items of consumption. Look at healthcare, look at education, look at housing. We consider all of these as essentials, and yet increasingly they become less and less affordable to many people. And so the state has to come in to provide them. So struggles, urban struggles, will be about struggles over consumption. In other words, over decision making. Who will decide and how will these decisions be made? How will these consumption goods be made available to more people? In the right to the city paradigm, the urban poor are informal settlers and at the same time the city's workforce. So their contribution as workers is more recognized. The pandemic has made visible the occupations of the urban poor and how essential they are to the urban economy. They work in transport, jeepneys, buses, tricycles, riders, even the MRT. They work in construction. They are the ones manning these delivery and logistics services, security, retail trade, household services, preparation of food preparation, as well as distribution of food. They are also the workers of micro and small enterprises. In other words, they are the daily frontliners, even before the pandemic. They are really the frontliners in delivering goods and services to people. And these are hidden struggles in the sphere of production, which still continues. Next slide. So this is my last slide. The COVID-19 pandemic reveals the unequal urban citizenship in many cities, among them Manila, but also Dhaka, Delhi, and many other cities. The inequalities have become more visible, but at the same time, emphasis on the urban citizenship. So citizenship is a two-way relationship. What citizenship connotes is that we receive something from the city or from the nation that we are a citizen of, but at the same time, we also contribute something to it. And that by virtue of that contribution, we see ourselves as citizens. And aside from the contribution, we also want a relationship of being able to influence decisions being made by the city and by our country. And that is how the urban poor have tried to claim their citizenship. So it's an insurgent notion of citizenship that they are trying to claim through these social processes and social struggles that they have been engaged in, and they are continuing to engage in. Okay, thank you. I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karaos, for a comprehensive and timely presentation. We now take this opportunity to extend the conversation to our audience. And if you don't mind, I will begin with the speaker-specific questions and then wrap up our conversation with the more general questions. No? So let me begin with a question that is addressed to Dr. Karaos. What do you think is the future of Manila now that our country has entered recession? What drastic changes should we anticipate in the next few years for Manila, considering that it is a capital and profit-generating city? And if things don't turn out well, will it be worse for the urban areas more? Your thoughts, Dr. Karaos. So it's a three-pronged question, really.
Of course, the recession is going to affect everybody. And it will, of course, hit the poor also, no? Because as I've shown, the poor are the labor force, no, of our economy. And they are really inserted in all sectors of the economy. And I've listed some of them. So any recession would, of course, hurt them. But at the same time, even as we recover from the recession, I think this is an opportunity to really shape the recovery so that we are more mindful of the maldistribution, no, of the resources in our society. No, so, for example, the pandemic has pointed to us serious deficiencies in the housing conditions, and how the poor housing conditions in just that affects only a quarter of the people living in the cities will affect everybody. Okay, so we now have to be concerned about our health, and we are seeing that our health depends on the health of the 25% who don't have good housing, and so we better pay attention to that housing issue. Second, primary health care. Okay, so we have issues now, no, about the PhilHealth and all of this. So these are important issues that we have to be concerned about, even as we're thinking about recovery. In other words, we cannot anymore think of recovery in isolation of these distributional issues of consumption, because they are very much interrelated. We cannot be just always concerned about production in the way we have been doing it before, like we're just going back to the old system, even though it has produced already these inefficiencies and dysfunctions that we're seeing today. We cannot go back to that. I think the pandemic is a wake-up call, and it's telling us we have to do things differently. And we have to look at the distributional impacts of our economy. So our recovery has to take that into account. Now, when we say that primary health care is important now, housing is important, housing for the poor is important, how do we then integrate that into our economic recovery plans? I think that's the way if we want to be sustainable. And also connecting that to the rural areas. So how do we make our economic recovery also functional for the rural environment of our cities?
Thank you, Dr. Karaos. The next question is addressed to Dr. Racelis, and this is something to do with an advice that is being asked of her. Getting out of our comfort zones is sometimes very difficult as a development worker or as a development specialist. And the one who's asking the question has experienced it, in fact. Do you have any solutions to overcome our fear or anxiety of moving out from our comfort zones or trying new paradigms, as you said? No? Could you give us more detailed advice about this matter, Dr. Racelis?
Yeah, I think you probably have to look for allies who are already working in those areas that you're apprehensive about to go to because you're not sure. And there are always intermediaries. With me, it's been through the NGOs that work in the communities, but in average communities, who are the people who are there all the time? I mean, who are in the kind of middle area of social development. They're the teachers. So the schools are often one way you can get in because the schools, teachers are trusted in the community. What are the community institutional strengths that seem to work or at least connect with people? Sometimes the health center, the barangay community health worker is, can be an ally, and so on. Well, you have the system of the barangay captain. That's always a security way. You're not sure how that will go, but sometimes if you have a valid reason for going to a community, you talk to the kapitan or and so on. Some of the local officials who are responsible for addressing community concerns and who give you the credibility or legitimacy to enter communities which may be not so sure, of who you are and why they should talk to you and whether you're a threat of some way. So I would say finding an intermediary that has credibility in the community, but also has some contact with the outside world like your own that can introduce you, because then you're always safe. You're not always, but you're safe once people recognize that you are not a threat to them and that maybe they'll gain something from your being there and so collaborate with you. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Racelis. We go back to Dr. Karaos. There is a question regarding the consultation process in the time of COVID. And the question goes, given the context of COVID-19, how is the consultation process likely to evolve since face-to-face contact is currently discouraged?
Yes, indeed, that is a challenge. In fact, we have been experiencing that our partner people's organizations are really being disadvantaged. We were when we're holding meetings, that because of the lack of access to the internet connection and to the load, to be able to participate in these meetings. And so that is a challenge that we are still trying to study how we can go around, maybe shifting some of our resources to be able to support the technological needs of our people's organizations, because after all, the NGOs might be saving on some expenses in their operating costs because of the online thing. So maybe shifting some of the savings there so that we can make available more resources to get the people's organizations still to get them to be able to participate in the consultation processes. For example, they have been issuing a number of calls about the housing, about livelihood, and about the amortization of their payments. No, the moratorium for the amortization of their housing units, those that have already been awarded housing units by the government. Now because of the loss of jobs and loss of income, they will have great difficulty paying for those for this amortization. And so definitely there will be dialogues, negotiations to be able to find a solution to this problem. But I suppose it will really be up to the NGOs and their partner communities to try to help each other find a way that the POs can continue to participate, given the challenges of not being able to do face-to-face consultations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karaos. Before we grapple with the last question, because we unfortunately have room for one last question, I would like to take this opportunity to apologize profusely to our spectators, to our audience, because of the immensity of material that we had to cover, that we had to commendably cover, by the way, and it's very important, compelling, and pressing. We needed to extend the time. No? So we are down to our last question, and this question is actually addressed to all the speakers. So we can probably begin with Dr. Lim in answering this question. The question goes, in your opinion, experience, what works best, community-led development or government-led through policies? Dr. Lim, please unmute your mic. Thank you.
I don't think it's a choice, actually. It's important to engage the community, but there are certain aspects where the government needs to lead development. The more important question, I suppose, is how do you engage the community? How do you get them involved in the process of development itself? First and foremost, for example, the process of development is supposed to be the task of everyone, like the task of people in the community as well as the government, even the business sector, and they have to work together, because otherwise we cannot conceptualize a society that is always in conflict with one sector or one realm against the other. It has to be it has to operate within one framework, and how we're going to integrate that is something that we need to work very hard for. Who's going to take the initiative? I think at this point in time, the community has already taken on the initiative of engaging the government. Perhaps the government, in some aspects, the government has actually responded, but it would be better, I suppose, if they can respond more actively and listen more to communities. But in terms of leading the development, it has to be an integrated approach. Cannot have one leading the other, I guess.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. Dr. Racelis, your thoughts?
Yeah, let me take this opportunity to say what is possible now, ideally, is let's take a look at the budget. From what people are saying, all these difficulties of the COVID and the implications, and what's next. And what is the government plan? And there's where this discussion needs to happen. And that's where the middle class and educators and academics and the business sector have to get serious about. Let's look at the budget, for example, of the government. All right, a lot of expenditures, which are good for allocating funds to poor people. But what's next? Let's look at the big budget. Do we really need to borrow huge amounts of money? Much of it is from China, for the Build program, for example. All right, do we really need all that infrastructure? Much of it in Metro Manila, very cement-oriented, very anti-environment. Do we really, for example, need the Kaliwa Dam, which still seems to be, and other dams, on the government roster of high priority? Maybe before. Why? Let's look at, are there other now higher priorities? Health centers, small hospitals, improving the supplies of recovery and so on. So the need to re-examine government budgets to move them more into long-term social sector support, which are economically viable and not this. In many of the build, we know there are really creating new forms of poverty by massive displacement along the railroad, for example, from Tutuban to Sorsogon. Now we need a railroad, but let's look at what's the displacement and what, if you need a train, everybody would love to have a good train, including the urban poor who community. But what about the thousands of families who are displaced without significant relocation options nearby their location? So let's use this opportunity to help begin this social transformation. And one way, I think, where you collaborate between communities, government, and the sector is re-examining the budget for more, a future which is more acceptable for what cities should be like, as discussed by Dr. Karaos, and the rural areas by Dr. Lim.
Thank you, Dr. Racelis. And finally, Dr. Karaos.
Yes, I think both are necessary, because in the examples that I've shown earlier about community-led development, they would not have been possible. I mean, the good fruits of that initiative would not have been possible if there had not been a government program, for example, that would provide financing to that housing development. Okay, so you really need both. What is important is that the government policies and laws make allowance or make a space wherein community interventions are possible, so that the policies can be made adapted to the specific situations of communities. So because policies are made for general application, but how they are applied in specific situations, that is creating a political space. And that is why the citizenship idea is, for me, a powerful concept, because it reminds us that we are citizens. We have responsibility. Being engaged is a responsibility. No, it's not something optional. If we want our cities to really be better than what they are now, we have the duty to engage. At the same time, government has also to recognize that citizenship, that is a right. People have to engage. The government cannot expect that people will only accept everything that they will impose, like lockdown, the very heavy-handed policies and guidelines that people are there that just to possibly obey. They have to be listened to, and this is a healthy process of development, that people get to be listened to because they have knowledge, as we have been finding out now in our courses, that they have important knowledge which will benefit development, and that is the role of government to listen to these ideas about how the policies and laws can be better applied to specific contexts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karaos. And on that note, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers for their generosity and for joining us this afternoon, for sharing their insights and thoughts about how to grapple with development in a time of unlimited uncertainties and unlimited risks. Allow us as well to thank the organizers, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, in partnership with the University for Peace in Costa Rica, the Nippon Foundation, and the Asian Peacebuilders Scholarship Program. A special shout out as well to the Kalipunang Sociologia at Anthropologia, the home organization of the DSA, for coming up with our advertisements and online promotions to further support and to further promote our webinar series. We would like to invite you once more for a webinar on transformative development, which will be happening on Friday, the 14th of August. So again, on behalf of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, SOCDV 203.4 students, and our speakers, our distinguished resource persons for this afternoon, we would like to thank you all, and until then, have a pleasant day.
Thank you.